Hello again, and thank you so much for taking time to listen to the very first recap from Unit 8. I am really excited to work with you this week on Unit 9, thinking more about material conditions affecting poetry. The sort of most current contemporary example I could think of was working from poetry that's published freely accessible and online, especially through Instagram. There's lots of sort of buzz about poets publishing through that particular platform, and I found quite a bit of research on how that impacts publication, reception, and dissemination of poetry. So that's what we're going to be thinking about this week, and I hope you're excited. I am by no means someone who knows Instagram intimately. I'm sort of new to it, like maybe some of you are, and so it was kind of interesting to see the ways in which poets are expressing and also relating their work to large audiences of thousands or more. So this week what we're going to be doing is, again, opening up the Unit 9 folder. Please revisit the Google Doc from the Play of Language again, just the comments that you left last week on those poems, see what kinds of replies you received, keep the conversation going, just to make sure that you acknowledge some of those comments you received. By Wednesday, what I'd like you to do is just double check that you've received some poem project feedback. Continue to revise that project, but there is no need to turn in anything about with regard to the poem project this week. But I do want you to leave 2 comments in our shared reading. The only reading that we have this week as a shared reading is called When is a Poet an Instapoet? Published in 2022 by a student who was thinking closely about the connections between reception, dissemination of poetry online. And what I'd like you to do is leave 2 comments that assess how the material conditions of publication, reception, and dissemination affect poetry published on Instagram. Please make sure to leave comments throughout the article, not just the intro or conclusion, but to demonstrate your comprehension of the entirety, maybe somewhere in the middle as well. To add a comment, this is actually a PDF, not a Word doc. Just right click and click on Open in a new tab. If you don't, Blackboard doesn't seem to like PDFs, so click Open, link in new tab. It'll open up our reading, which is a little bit more lengthy, but it's important to take time to look at it because it actually provides you some examples of what Instagram poetry looks like and how we can assess it more formally for our classroom setting. It's called When is a Poet an Instapoet? The Effect of Platformization on the Practice of Being a Poet. And Instapoets is examples of poetry contest creators in the social media entertainment ecosystem. So it kind of talks a little bit, I think, in helpful ways about this particular phenomenon, poet, author, producer, and creator. And then in the second half of the article, there's a set of examinations of 5 poets from a corpus of belonging to a larger study on Scandinavian Instapoetry. And so they talk about these 5 Instapoets and thinking about how their accounts are creative, what kind of poems they're producing, and what kinds of audiences they're reaching. So it's kind of a nice example, especially for those who are kind of new to Instagram. It describes like the different features of profiles, of sharing, and of commenting on these kinds of poems. Again, please read this article by Wednesday and leave 2 comments. You can add a comment by using this little sticky note feature in PDF form, and others can then see what you have written. But then as you read, remember to think about specifically the material conditions of publication for Instagram, what's sort of interesting about those features. I've also included some extra readings, The Rise of the Citizen Author, On the Rise of Insta Artists and Insta Poets, and Notes on Poetic Writing and Digital Culture. And those are all sort of, again, concerned with reading poetry, its reception, dissemination, and publication. Perhaps the most exciting project for this week, in addition to sort of reading about this phenomenon, is to actually dig in and examine for yourself some of the poems. So by Wednesday, or if you still need a couple more days, Friday is okay too, I want you to read, after reading that short article above, I want you to create a new page on your existing Google site. We haven't done this for a little while, for a few weeks. So we're going to open a new page on your existing site, and I want you to examine how poets share work, gain new followers, and find readers. I want you to choose an Instapoet from Instagram. You may have to create an account, but you should be able to do that using your Google credentials that you've had to create for this class. Your Instapoet should have either been called an Instapoet and or have in some way labeled their own poetry with the hashtag label for Instapoetry and tagging themselves in the phenomena of Instapoetry. So you can feel free, if you're more familiar with Instagram, you can just sort of find your own poet, like do some searching, see what's out there. Discover your own poets, or examine some of the most celebrated Instapoets. There are some that have been sort of created quite a bit of buzz, right? Rupi Kaur is probably the most famous of those, but any of these are also like highly discussed and sort of highlighted in the internet. So feel free to use any of these, but you're also able to sort of peruse on your own. I was doing a little bit of perusing. I'm still not sort of expert at this, but I came across a poet called Ranaj, and you'll see that there are tags here: Islam, Dari poetry, Urdu poetry, Arabic poetry, and it's composed by Ghazaliyat. So you'll notice that that has 55,000 followers, 217 posts, and kind of just the different types of poetry that this particular Instapoet is sharing. To learn more about the poets, you can click on the sort of signature here, and it takes you to their page. And I think unless you're following them, you can only see just so much about them. To kind of search for poets, you can click on the search button. If there's someone in particular you want to find, then you can type in their names here. Here's Rupi Kaur, who is probably one of the most famous Instapoets out there. And you'll notice that she has 4.5 million followers. You can learn more about her by clicking on her profile, when she joined. You'll also see that she's got lots of poems sort of tagged here below. With each poem, there's comments that you can see. There's lots of likes, and sometimes she responds to those comments as well. Sometimes you'll notice that when you click on an image, the poets will comment on what exactly they're writing about. So this is "Depression Doesn't Knock," a poem I wrote when I finally stepped out of denial and accepting that I needed to get help. Hope you enjoy it. And then you can kind of see the sort of conversations that have followed. So what I'd like you to do is, after sort of discovering and kind of weaving your way through this brave new world in the Instagram Instapoet world, I'd like you to include on your own website just an examination like we did in Unit 7 of a poet, in Instapoet specifically. I want you to do 3 things. 1, include a poet account overview. For example, the article above does this for each of the 5 poets that they examine. You'll put sort of their tag here and then just a little description of what you can kind of gather about that particular poet from the website. I'd also like you to examine the platform labor, which is a term that is used again in that article that you're reading by Wednesday. In other words, how does the poet use this to circulate their work and make it visible? For an example would be, how does the poet caption their poems? For the caption to be interacted with, asking the audience to tag someone who they consider a bestie. Another example of this type of visible labor is done by a different poet. She posts a poem from her self-published poetry collection, and she tags a Norwegian princess, Martha Louise, as the poem vaguely could address someone like her. The results in the poem getting a spike in 2,600 likes, both by employing event hashtags and by asking followers to tag others or tagging other known persons themselves. Poets are actively working on circulating their poetry. So how, in other words, is a poem trying to circulate their work? In what ways are they doing that? Is it by using images? Is it by using hashtags? Is it because it's referencing other popular figures or poets? Can you kind of determine how they're trying to circulate their work, how to make it visible? In addition to being on Instagram, what are some other features of that circulation? And then finally, of course, I want you to select the poem, or 2 is fine. I want you to duplicate their page, one of their poems, and just complete an initial analysis. I want us to think about, is there a perceptible quality to this poem that would suggest the content is in some way tied to the medium of Instagram? If we were to take this poem and sort of have it appear in a published chapbook, for example, is there a different kind of quality to Instagram poetry? And maybe that's too broad of a question, but I want us to just thinking about how we view poetry, how we access poetry, and what are some sort of formal features that we notice about the poem that you've collected. And remember that we did that sort of brief formal analysis in Unit 7, thinking about a theme, any sort of formal elements like symbolic objects, meter, rhyme, and then the sort of arc of the actual content itself to come up with an initial reading of that poem. So I want us to select one or two poems and come up with a reading of that poem, all the while thinking about, how does this poem compare to others we've read before? Is it similar to or different from them? And is that sort of medium of Instagram a feature in that distinction? So please publish this by Wednesday, Friday at the very latest, so we can kind of see what you've uncovered in this sort of Instapoet world. And then by Sunday, I want you to visit 5 other portfolio pages and offer feedback. You don't have to wait till Sunday to do that. Some of you are sort of earlier on your publication posts and replies, but by Sunday at the latest, please look back at those ePortfolio pages and provide feedback on any aspect of the ways the material conditions of the publication on Instagram affect the reception, dissemination, and poetry itself. I hope that this is a fun project. Really just sort of experiment and explore this contemporary realm this week. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you dig up and how you sort of account for the publications that we find on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful week.